Alright, want to welcome everyone to this class on the Noahide laws. I want to welcome everyone. We're going to speak about interesting topic. I think they're all interesting, actually. But interesting topic, about sickness. How do you look at sickness? So sickness, there are two guarantees in life. First guarantee, right, is death. That we all know. What's the second guarantee? Taxes. Not necessarily in that order. Guarantee do things, right? But sickness, we understand, certainly part of life, right? Part of the human life cycle. Just like, birth, just like death. So here, we're going to speak about visiting people that are sick. So definitely 100% a positive command, an obligation for Jews. Now, it's not really part of the Noahide laws. Now, though, even if it's not part of the Noahide laws, maybe we would say it's a moral imperative. It's definitely a good thing, right? It's a good thing for them. It's a good thing for society, right, in general, right? It would make sense logically. Therefore, it could be one of the mitzvahs, what we call mitzvahs hamuskalos, which is logically compelled mitzvahs. So, if it's something that makes sense, logically, then a non-Jew can practice it, can adopt it, even with details the way the Jews do it. Now, we're going to see the details in a second. But wouldn't the details be obvious? You go visit someone that's sick, right? Like someone will say, how complicated can that be? How difficult, can these laws be? But there's a lot of other significance, right? There's a lot of theological significance. We're going to see the source, how it applies and what's going on over here. So the Gemara says in a few different places, Ksuvas 38, b.Mitzvah 107b, all illnesses are from heaven, except for the common cold. Right? In other words, someone gets sick, in general, where does sickness come from? From above. So the commentaries explain that some illnesses are definitely decreed from heaven. Others could be negligence. Right now, we can't blame God for negligence. There's a 614th commandment, right? Coffman would say, don't be stupid. And the 615th commandment, don't be a moron. So if a person walks outside, for an extended period of time, and it's freezing cold out, and they're walking outside in shorts and a tank top, they're stupid. And what happens if they get sick? Their own fault. God's going to say, person after 120 years, say, God, why didn't you stop me over here? Why didn't you help me? God says, I didn't tell you to go out in the snow when it was freezing. So who told you to do that? Right? If it's negligence, person failed to bundle up in the cold, or person decided, they're gonna run 10 miles, and it's like 100 degrees. So that's foolish. That 100% is foolish. But any illness cannot be explained by negligence. The person who's sick. So why did the person get sick? Definitely decree. For example, the Gemara says, no one so much as bruises a finger on earth unless it's decreed against them in heaven. In other words, you can't jam a finger. You can't bang your head. You can't do other things unless it's a decree from heaven. Person can say, well, nothing bad's ever happened in my life. I had someone tell me this. I haven't really sick or anything. They bike ride a lot. Went down hell, missed the clutch, right? They missed the clutch, right? And they went too fast. Got thrown off the bike. Broke the collarbone. bruised 6 vertebrae. So what happened over here? The Crete, God knocked them around. It could have been a lot worse. God knocked them around. They were going too fast. Couldn't stop. Right? They had no way to stop. So, person wasn't negligent over here. Right? It's just funny. People say, nothing happened, whatever. Yeah, this person was way up for months. For a number of months. Right? You know what you do for broken vertebrae? Nothing. Nothing to do. No operation to do. You're in pain. Person had to sleep on a recliner. Couldn't sleep that much. Was in pain. Everything healed. Right? Eventually. But, what was the excuse? Whatever. Tried to turn too fast, whatever the case is. Misjudged it, and that's what happened. Well, that's not what happened. God made you misjudge it. That's what happened. It's a decree. You should get hurt. Wake up call. Probably didn't get waking up from that, but okay. The wake up call. Now, prayer always helps. Right? Helps for all sickness. Even though a person, let's say, brought the sickness upon themselves. So now they pray that God should heal them. Right? Nonetheless, it's of special importance for illnesses decreed by heaven. Right? So we just said, when something happens, it's a wake-up call. It's an impetus for them to examine their deeds in relationship to God. Now, keep in mind, it's also brought down that, a person hurts their hand, their leg, their arm. Most likely, they did something wrong. They transgressed a prohibition of the Torah with their hand, their arm, whatever. But it's a wake-up call. Total wake-up call. Question is if a person wakes up or not. That's a different, that's a different issue. But it's a wake-up call over here. So when a person sees that suffering has come upon him, what should he do? Gemara says in Proverbs 5a, examine his behavior. And Rabbi Alexandri said the name of Rabbi Chaim Coffman, one who is sick cannot be healed unless he first is forgiven all his sins. That's the Gemara in the Dawning 41a. That's a pretty scary proposition. In other words, if you don't properly repent, you're not going to get healed. Right? You're going to be forgiven for all his sins. So you say, what about secular people? They don't do that. They're not, they're not repenting for their sins. They don't think they do anything wrong. You ever hear anyone, you ever hear an American say they did anything wrong? Never. Look at this thing now. You've been following the news. This whole thing was kind of Irving. Right? What an idiot. What he did. After he got suspended, then he made a statement. For another statement, he looked like an idiot. Total idiot. He didn't apologize. He didn't apologize at all. He said, well, some of it, this, that. He didn't apologize. Oh, now he got suspended? Yeah, now he opened up his mouth. He still probably believes the world is flat. Let's go and, keep in mind one thing. If this is a white person against a black person, this person suspended without pay the entire year. There's nothing to talk about. Be suspended without pay. Oh, he said something about Jews, anti-Semitic. No, he only got 5 games. Right? We'll see. Community service, maybe some other things. It's a joke. It's a joke over here. Right? That's why I mentioned it. Somebody like that, he got sick. Let's say he got sick. He's only going to get healed because he's forgiven all the sins? How was the sins forgiven? Certainly, if that's the case, then a non-Jew, or even a Jew in this case, don't have to do anything. In other words, how does he get healed? So the Gemara says over here, he gets healed because all the sins are forgiven. So somebody like that, how is the sin forgiven? How sick you and you, how is their sin forgiven? I don't know. Good question. They don't do anything to forgive his sins. So God may give it to them anyway for different reasons. Right? Possible answer. You'll say, well, that's really how a person should be healed. Good. But if they don't do that, why does God heal them? Could be for any number of reasons. Because God still wants them in the world, so he heals them. Or maybe not. But if you say that it's only healed when he's forgiven for all the sins, there's some people, they're not repenting. They're nowhere near repenting. So how are their sins forgiven? How do they get better? They have to say something else going on. And we have another source. Rosh Hashanah 18a, Rabbi Meir used to say, two people take to their beds with the same illness. One recovers while the other doesn't. One prays is answered, the other one who prays not answered. Why is one answered and the other not? Because this one prayed with sincerity, the other did not. If you want to try and take away sickness, you got to pray from the depths of your heart. But it's hard because you're sick. Nonetheless, that's what you got to do. Have other people pray for you. One of the great Hasidic masters summed it up well. In the name of the Maggid of Mezrich, a small hole in the body means a big hole in the soul. In other words, there are body parts inside correspond to all kinds of different things. So if a person gets sick physically, there's something wrong with them spiritually. Right? That's what he's saying. Right? There's a big hole in the soul. Yeah. Spiritually you're not well. That's why physically you're not well. There's a connection. Because we are body and soul. So not only should the individual who's sick examine their deeds and pray, others should pray for them as well. Because the Gemara in Brachos 55b tells me, if a person's sick for more than a day, should let people know so they'll pray for him. Right? Prayer goes a long way. Prayers of the righteous also pretty important. If someone has a sick person in his house, you go to a stage, ask him to pray for them. Right? Or if you can't get there, get to him. Have someone else go to him and ask to pray for him. Or whatever the case is. Prayer always helps. Right? Prayer always helps. What's the problem? Sometimes the answer is no. Or, I'm going to let you suffer a little bit more before I answer yes. Right? Could be yes, could be no, could be maybe. It depends. Now, what's the mitzvah visiting the sick? So a number of places in Talmud, in other places as well, that a person should want to imitate the attributes of God. Alright, Gemara says in Sota 14a, Bava 38, we want to imitate God. We want to imitate his attributes. And what are one of the attributes? He visits presence upon the sick. Right? We're going to read it this week's parsha. Right? Parshas Vayera. Genesis chapter 18 verse 1. Torah tells me, now the Lord appeared to him, to Avraham, in the plains of Mamre, as he was sitting at the entrance of the tent when the day was hottest. Abraham's after circumcision, looking for a guest, God came to heal him. Right? Visit him. And even though God's talking to him, he sees these three Arabs, and he says, God, I'll get back to you. I got these three guests. So what do we learn? Right? What do we learn? We learn that having guests is even more important than speaking to God. Right? One thing you learn from that conversation. So Talmud, Bava 86a tells me, this occurred on the third day after Avram's circumcision. And the Gemara says the third day is what? The hottest day of the circumcision. Most pain. Most discomfort. So God over there, there's a separate visitation. For the appearance of other three visitors. These three Arabs were angels, disguised as Arabs. Right? Because three visitors appear in verse 2. Right? Three visitors come. Abraham took heed of the Lord. He took leave of him. And he said, my Lord, finally have found favor in your eyes. Please not pass on from beside your servant. Right, Genesis chapter 18, verse 3. Now, Abraham revisited. What's the obvious question? Right? Obvious question is that why does God need to visit? You got 3 angels going to visit him. That's why does God appear to Abraham? Visitation seems superfluous in the context of the story. So the Gemara and the Medrash say, God visited Abraham to comfort him. Inquire of his welfare. Now, doesn't God know everything? Doesn't God know the thoughts of men? Right? Does he need to do that? No. But he did it anyway. He did it anyway as part of visiting and providing comfort. Now, the question now is this a rabbinic obligation? Visit the sick or a Torah obligation? Now, the question is going to be, what's the purpose of the mitzvah? If the reason is we're imitating God's qualities, then everyone agrees it's rabbinic. The fact that God acts a certain way doesn't necessarily mean it's a Torah obligation for us to act in a similar way. And also, if you look at it that way, it's kind of dangerous as well. Right? Because God can do whatever he wants. He doesn't need me, doesn't need any of us. God can do whatever he wants when he wants. We're limited. Why? What are we limited by? God's will. Yeah, so we have free choice. That's true. It's also limited. Spoke about that in Derech Hashem. It's also limited to a certain extent. But God can strike down, judge, reward as he sees fit. Man, we have to observe whatever God says. Even if we disagree, or we don't understand them, right? God is going to say, 15th of Nisan. 15th of Nisan, got to eat matzah. So, Coffman's law, you got to eat 35 pounds of matzah in 25 seconds. You have to whistle Dixie. But you can't whistle. You know why? Because the matzah stick. And it sticks to your palate. So imagine if my Seder, I get my kids say, okay, look, after eating all the matzah, eat the bitter herbs, you eat the hero sandwich, the matzah and the bitter herbs together with the charoset, all together. So, you've eaten all this matzah, you can't, how can you whistle? It's like having peanut butter stuck at the top of the roof of your mouth. Right? It's like, you can't do it. Right? So they say, wow, what a great mitzvah. What an unbelievable mitzvah, eat all this matzah. Right? They gotta understand. Gotta understand what the mitzvahs are. Even if we don't understand them, still gotta keep it. So even with positive mitzvahs, positive commands, let's say to eat matzah on Passover, or keep certain laws of Shabbos, positive commands. Nonetheless, God's behavior doesn't establish obligatory biblical precedent for man. What's the example? Jews keep Shabbos. Why? Because they're commanded. Right? God says, keep Shabbos. Sign between me and you. Not because the Torah tells us God rested on the 7th day. You might think, why do we keep Shabbos? We keep Shabbos because God rests on the 7th day. No! You know why we keep Shabbos? Because Torah told me. Right? We're commanded to do so. Not because God rested. That's not the reason we do it. It's true. The 7th day, whatever that means. But that's not the reason why we do it. Now, another possible reason over here is, maybe it's a general mitzvah of Gimus Chasodim, doing acts of loving kindness, right, in the world. Maybe that's the reason. Nothing to this, that would be a Torah obligation. Right? As the Ron says in Brachos, page 3, he holds it's 100% a Torah obligation. So there's a whole discussion over here. Now, the overwhelming opinion is This specific mitzvah visiting the sick in all its details, really, it's rabbinic. Right? The Rambam holds that, others hold that. That's rabbinic. But there are some biblical merit, for kindness committed during the fulfillment of the mitzvah. So now, what about Noahides? So the mitzvah for them, it's a logical act. Logical act of kindness. Beneficial. Beneficial to the person, beneficial to society, beneficial to them. Nonetheless, the mitzvah accomplishes many of the same purposes and goals as the Jewish rabbinic mitzvah. So it's similar. So in this sense, we would say they have a similar obligation. Noahides would have a similar obligation to Jews. So there are two opinions, right? Whether we're going to say it's rabbinic or, biblical, but it seems, majority opinion is it's biblical. Now, we mentioned that visiting the sick is beneficial, practically, spiritually, for both, for the patient and for the visitor. The Gemara in Devarim 48 and other places as well tells me God's presence, the Shekhinah, hovers above the head of someone who's sick. In much the same way, God visited Abraham, that he was like above him. So too, God continues to visit anyone who's sick. Now, illness can wipe away a lot of sin. It's atonement. God wants a person, if they're sick, to repent. Maybe they're too sick to repent, but they need to repent. And the Shekhinah stands ready to receive their prayers. Now, one of the great commentators of Impetus says, in order for illness to atone, a person has to acknowledge they're being punished for their sins, and that the illness is for the sake of atonement. Right? Others say, as long as they're sick, it can atone anyway. Right? The Mabit disagrees. Mabit says you got to have intention for atonement. Right? But what does God want when He knocks someone on and makes them sick? He wants to hear them pray. So it's all above. Others should pray for the patient as well. So if you visit the sick person, take the opportunity to pray. Wish the patient recovery right before God. So here, that's the fundamental reason over here. Right? This is one of the fundamental reasons. To pray that this person is well, be moved to pray for his own health. Right? So a person gets sick, and everybody knows, right? So they're going to pray for him or her. The visitors see the person suffering. They understand it's got to atone, should make an impression. And that should make them move to pray for them as well. And for his own health, be thankful for his own health. The Vilna Gaon, more than 250 years ago, his students were suffering from poverty, abject poverty. So before Shabbos, he would send them to visit people in the hospital. See, people couldn't take care of their own needs. People were suffering, people in pain. And they would come into Shabbos very different. Because at least they're not in pain. At least they can take care of their needs. So yeah, they sit down the Shabbos meal, and they're eating soup that has no vegetables because they have no food. And they're suffering that way, okay, but at least they're not ill. At least they can take care of their needs. Right? When a person sees someone suffer, yeah, one of the obvious things is you want to pray for them to get better. True. At the same time, you got to be thankful. You don't have that. And if you are sick, but you don't have what they have, you're better off. So you got to be thankful. For sure you got to be thankful. Because we always say, if God wanted to, God can make it worse for us. We're not interested. Right? But we got to look at the bigger picture. That's why the Vilna Gaon sent his students there. in order that they understand, you're right, they're suffering from poverty. True? But it could be a lot worse. They could also be sick. So a practical aspect of the mitzvah is making sure the ill person has all their physical needs taken care of, i.e. medical supplies, clothing, food, right? They have their needs taken care of. Patients staying in the hospital, maybe it's not the main focus because the hospital taking care of them, right? Because the hospital staff is charged with taking care of them. Today, though, what is one of the most important things here? It's the emotional need of the patient. Being sick is emotional. You can't move, you can't function, depending on what it is. You're also in a challenging situation. Not only that, people in the hospital, it's kind of boring, right? It's lonely. It's depressing. So if a person provides company, they try and cheer them up, right? Ramosha Feinstein, a blessed memory, and his commentary on Parsha and Parshas Vayera says that when God visited Abraham, God didn't say anything to him. In other words, he just sat there, so to speak. In other words, his presence alone was tremendous comfort. Now, a person has to know how to comfort someone. A person goes to visit someone and says, wow, you got it so easy here. You're so comfortable. You got 3 square meals. They don't want to hear that. You got to know how to comfort. Someone told the story. The great rabbi told the story. A guy goes in, to visit someone, someone who's sick. Visiting the hospital, so you got it so easy. I got, this problem, I got to take my kids and this and that. Look, all your needs to be taken care of. You're getting 3 square meals. And meanwhile, it's like monitor is going nuts. Right? This patient's monitor is like going, unbelievably. So the medical staff runs in, like, I don't know what you did or what you said. Get out of here right now. You're killing the patient. You have to know how to visit. You have to know how to talk or not talk. Right here, God doesn't say anything to him. God visits. That's it. That's the comfort. So who's considered sick, right? How does this mitzvah apply? Who's considered sick over here? It can apply to anyone who's dangerously ill, right? That'll make the most sense, right? The Don 40, someone seriously ill. Doesn't apply, let's say, a person with a minor ailment. Let's say he's got a headache, he's got a cold, right? In other words, he got 2 extremes. Did he tell me he's extremely sick? Or he's not really that sick. He's got a cold, he's got the flu, whatever. Not, 2 opposite extremes. There are many guidelines over here. Right? Many different customs, interpretations, how all this is applied. Right? But in general, anybody who's hampered in their ability to move because they're in pain or illness, they used to be flat in their back, can't move. They're considered sick. Comes on Prague. Right? So it brings out his commentary in Genesis chapter 18. We learn it out from Abraham. During the first 2 days following the circumcision, Abraham's quote unquote injured. Where is he injured? One place. Right in the single rib. But that injury did not affect his entire body. He can move. Right? He can, maybe he's a little bit pain, but he can, doesn't affect his entire body until the 3rd day. 3rd day comes along, he's in tremendous pain. It's an unbelievable pain. Person who had a broken arm, they're not necessarily considered sick once the pain has subsided. Right, until they're up and about. Nonetheless, you see, the person requires assistance. Well, I have an old son last summer, for like a month, had a minor fracture. They finally, after everything, they finally found something minor. The kid was in pain. They put something on him. Eventually, they put a cast so it wouldn't move, but he was in pain. And after a week, kid can't sleep. He's on, pain medication, this, that. They finally found it was like a slight break. Slight. They put a cast on it. They said, a kid cannot be in that much pain. There's no break. Right? It's hard to imagine. But yeah, it was slight. But kid was in tremendous pain. Couldn't sleep. Medication wore off. He was in pain. It took a while. It took a while, for him to get better. He was in tremendous pain. Right? So, even someone like that's not really considered sick if the pain is subsided, but, once they're in pain, it's a different issue. So even if they're not, the whole body's not sick, once the pain subsides, to a point where he's up and about, okay, we see it doesn't affect necessarily the whole body. Nonetheless, you see if the person needs anything. Now, let's say a person not dangerously ill, who says you have to go visit him. Unless the illness type we described, let's say sick for more than one day. Sick for a couple of days. Because we see, what's the proof? We see God didn't visit Abraham until after 2 days. Right? That we see. So according to many, this exemption applies to others, not to the patient's family. So this we're going to see what does it apply to. Applies to the family. Maybe other people it doesn't apply. Right? Maybe other people it's totally not going to apply, but the family it's going to apply. The mitzvah also applies. You're going to say, well, maybe it doesn't apply to a woman. Also applies to a woman. Who's on bed rest, let's say. She's pregnant, she can't move. Or is on bed rest for other things. Or someone's confined to their home. What about someone who's mentally ill? That's the whole question. You visit someone that's mentally ill, that's the same thing. Right? Not clear. Now, there are guidelines over here. Person goes visit the sick. The visitor will overdo their expressions of concern, maybe cause unnecessary stress. That's always bad. You got to be pleasant. You ask the patient what they need. You don't do anything unless the patient really asks for it. So first thing is you plan ahead. First of all, you got to check and see if they want visitors. Right? That's the most obvious thing. You don't show up. Maybe they need to sleep. Whatever the case is. You don't show up for no reason. You got to see. Do they want visitors? Find out from the family. When's the best time to visit? No surprises, not before entering. Now you think that's obvious. There are people who think they know better. Come anyway, burst in, this, that. Protocol. I would say simple protocol. Just go when you're not, you don't know the situation. Find out. Find out somebody who knows. And see if they can take, if they want to see people, they don't want to see people. When to visit. Relatives, very close friends, should go pretty much immediately. Others should wait, let's say, until 2 full days have passed. If you're doubtful, you wait 2 days. Right? In other words, close family, friends, you go straight away. You don't have to wait. One should avoid visiting a sick person during the first 3 or last 3 hours of the day. However, there are no other times, then you can visit. Unless, as long as it's okay. Right? In other words, the patient's up to it. Can you go in groups? If a group is not going to cause distress or inconvenience, it should be okay. Some say you should only go one at a time. But, if they're able to see people in the group, they can go with the group. Because of the presence of God's presence, one should make himself presentable before going to visit. Maybe don't look like a schrep. I'm not saying you have to go in a suit and tie, right? But, you should dress appropriately. Where should you sit? You don't sit higher than the patient. Patient's lying upon the floor. Visitor should sit on the floor. You don't sit higher than the patient. According to Zohar, shouldn't sit behind or right alongside the head of the patient. Why? Because we mentioned before. That's where God's presence is. If a patient is dangerously ill, don't sit by the patient's feet. Why? Because that's the position of the Malach HaMavis, angel of death. He's sitting by the feet, right? He's getting ready. He's getting ready to take him, maybe. You definitely do not want to come in contact, at any time, place, with the angel of death. Now, what about praying? Praying for the sick. Visitor should pray for the welfare of the sick person. Now, you should do it in front of them, if possible. And if it's going to make the patient self-conscious or uncomfortable, you don't want to do that, right? In other words, it's going to make them feel, might make them feel bad or whatever the case is. So if they don't want it, so you do it later. But you don't do it in front of them. What do you say to them? You say, may you merit a full recovery, or may Hashem heal you, or some other simple, expression is going to be good enough. Don't mention the name of the ill person when praying for them in their presence. That's, you're praying for someone, you don't necessarily mention their name in there unless they don't care, right? But if you say the name of in their name in their presence, it's, it's hard for them to hear because they know you're praying for them. Who do we learn it out from? We learn it out from Moses praying for his sister's recovery. When it mentions his sister's recovery, Numbers chapter 12, verse 13, right? You'll see over there, it doesn't mention her name. So going out from there, you don't mention his name in front of him. Right? Because doing so can actually bring harsh judgment. It actually brings harsh judgment, against the person. If the person is asleep or unconscious, now what's the purpose of visiting the sick? Pray for their recovery. Now, does it matter if the person's unconscious? No. Now, it doesn't matter if they're aware of the presence of the visitor or not. Nonetheless, it's still a mitzvah to visit, even if they're in a coma, even if they're unconscious, even if they're asleep, right? It's still a mitzvah over here. Doesn't matter. You might think, the only mitzvah is when they're awake. Who says? Who says when they're awake? Even when they're not awake, right? You can still visit them. If visiting the patient is going to disturb his sleep, then you shouldn't be there until they're awake. These things they're all common sense. You don't go, unless you ask people closest to the patient, are they having visitors? Are they awake? How do they feel? Whatever. Or, you don't go when they're sleeping. They need to sleep. They need the rest. Body needs to rest. The Medrash and the Gemara say that visiting a sick person removes 1/60th of his illness. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean exactly? So, not exactly clear. But how do we learn? We learn it's that visiting a sick person is of great benefit to heal him. They're going to say 1/60, so you get 60 people, the person will be healed. Maybe. Right? But the point is that going heals the person. Right? Not saying 100%, but it helps. 100%. Going, you cheer the person up. You try and give them strength. Different things. You have to do right. Again, there are people who think they know better, like they're going to reinvent the wheel, and they're going to do things that are going to make the person, feel worse. You don't speak unless they speak to you. Certainly don't want to go, if they're sleeping, you're going to bother them. I mean, there are a lot of things over here that make common sense. But you know what? Not everyone has common sense. People think they're doing a great thing, and really they're causing more stress. Right? So, here are guidelines, for visiting the sick. And we see from here, certainly a non-Jew can do it, right? Most likely, similar in many ways to a Jew. It's a rabbinic obligation. Right? That's how it sounds. Right? That majority of rabbinic authorities hold it's rabbinic over here. It's not a total obligation. Right? But it also makes sense because it helps the person. certainly, a person's going to thank God for the goodness that they have. Make them look into their actions also. It's also good for the patient. A person goes, gives them strength, tells them they should have a speedy recovery. It also helps them. But they don't understand. Let's say a person's in the hospital, they're lonely. They're bored. Can't do much. Especially if they're not feeling well. So therefore, it's a good thing. We have to know how long to stay. Also, you don't want to wear them out. Again, these are common things. So that is the mitzvah of visiting the sick. And how it applies. So any questions on any of that? Or anyone have any general questions? Someone asked, change the name of the sick. Is that a verbal name change enough? Some, if they're very sick, some will say you change the name. Why? Yes, you add a name. Why do you add a name? Because adding a name, then the person's not the same person. So that should give the ability to be healed. So yeah, that's a verbal thing. In other words, when a person prays for them, if their name was, let's say, Shmuel ben Avram, but they added a name, Chaim, so you say, there should be a full recovery for Chaim Shmuel ben Avram. That's his name now. Right? They added an extra name. Right? This is known to help. Definitely known to help by adding an extra name. I mean, that guaranteed, not a guarantee, but that's how you do it. Right? It's a verbalization of that name. Right? In other words, it's a verbal name change. Right? You say that this person now, again, you added the name. So whatever that first name is, you add the name to it. Again, the first name is, Shmuel, you add the name Chaim, or whatever, Aryeh, whatever name you add. That name comes first, then their name, and then the son of, you go after the mother. For healing purposes, you go after the mother. So you say, Chaim Shmuel ben Miriam, or Sarah, or Rivka, or, whatever the case is. Oh, wow. This is my wife, almost passed, and had a speedy recovery. Yeah. There's what to be said for it. Yeah, definitely true. All right, I know other cases that didn't help, but, it has the ability, no question. Definitely no question. Any other questions or whatever, any general questions? All right, great. So anyone has any questions, feel free. You can shoot me an email. Otherwise, I'm going to sign out. Wish everyone a good middle of the day or almost end of the day for me. And everyone have a great rest of the week.